Hey everybody, this is Robert from Black Belt Gaming. I am back with you for some more advanced Dungeons & Dragons First Edition review and analysis, and we're taking a look here as part of my series at the Cleric. I must say, starting off here, the Cleric was probably one of the least played classes among my group when I started playing years ago. I don't know why that is. I think I played Clerics more than anybody else. But let's talk about what the Cleric is. Here is some artwork from one of the Cleric spells called Locate Object. You can see he's over there trying to locate the treasure in the next room. But there is a picture of a cleric there, a drawing. You can see him standing there beside a wizard and a fighter. Well, a cleric is a spellcaster, but not in the same sense as a wizard. The cleric uses spells of divine origin, meaning it's comes through prayer from God or from the gods, and he's kind of a mixture of fighter and magic user. He can wear armor like the fighter. He can use weapons, but in first edition the weapons were limited to blunt weapons. You can see in that drawing that he's carrying a mace, and you can see the round head of the mace down there. Things like staves and clubs and maces were all acceptable, but anything like a sword, a dagger, bows and arrows, or anything that had any sort of slashing or piercing effect was basically considered to be against their belief system. So in later editions, the weapon selection for clerics became much more flexible. And even there became, it may have even been as soon as second edition, you could choose a weapon for your cleric that was connected to a particular weapon that your god favored. So, you know, if you worshipped Thor, it was going to be the hammer. But there might be another god of war who favors a battle axe, which is certainly a hacking and slashing weapon. And if you served that god, then you could use that weapon. So that kind of flexibility became later. So there are still people that argue about whether clerics should be allowed some more flexibility in their weapons of choice. So we know they're going to cast some spells, and we'll look at that in a minute. But let's take a look at, by the book, what their weapon selection was. Well, you can see the cleric right there at the top. Any armor is allowed, which is great. Shields, yes. Weapons, club, flail, hammer, mace, and staff. That's it. That is it. No crossbows. That came along in later editions. So, blunt weapons. When you think about a cleric, you kind of want to imagine, or at least as it was imagined early in earlier editions, kind of looking at the Crusades, the Templars. These are warriors of the church, kind of focused on a campaign to fight in the name of God. It could be to defend the church. It could be to reclaim treasure for the church, whatever. So you kind of have this image that comes to mind of a man, thinking historically, dressed in mail, usually like chainmail or something, with a helmet and maybe wearing one of these tunics, these white tunics with the red cross on the chest or something. Anyway, in a fantasy game, anything goes. You've got some choices, of course, male, female. You've got some different races that you can choose from, but not as many as you would imagine, like we talked about. Some classes allow for clerics to be an NPC class, like for dwarves, but by the book there are no dwarf clerics. So strictly by the book you couldn't play one until a later book came out, and we'll talk about that book at another time. Spells, well, you've got some spells available. Different from basic Dungeons and Dragons, I think clerics didn't get any spells at first level. They kind of had to prove themselves worthy to start receiving prayers and spells from their gods. So here in first edition you are allowed one first level spell. So as members of the clergy, they're not quite as powerful or strong as your straight fighter, so they're going to be using a d8 for their hit points. And leveling up. I wonder in comparison to the fighter what we're talking about here. Let's see if I can find the fighter real quickly. A little bit faster. Where the fighter may have taken 2,000 experience points to get to second level, or 2,001, Cleric's going to take about 500 less. So what else can they do besides casting some spells, using armor and blunt weapons? Well, they have some other abilities which include battling the undead, things that are against the natural order or the way of the gods. Think, typically again, think about things that are against the church. If you think about, I just finished a board game playthrough of Fury of Dracula, and you think about how the crucifix, the sign of the church, the sign of God, causes a vampire to recoil in fear. That's where some of this inspiration is coming from. So if we move over here, we can see that the clerics have some abilities to battle the undead. There we are. Ghasts, ghosts, ghouls, liches, mummies, shadows, skeletons, specters, wights, wraiths, vampires, and zombies. So it's not an automatic thing. They do have to attempt to have their faith shine through, and of course the higher level the cleric, the stronger his or her ability to turn or destroy the undead. And then if you played an evil cleric, you could even make these things your minions, I guess. I never played an evil cleric, but there we have it, these kind of warrior priests, not in the kung fu monk-like character, different from that. We'll talk about the monk later. This is more of the soldier of the church, heavily armored, praise to the gods for power. And I guess the big thing here is about whether or not in your campaign you'll use blunt weapons or not. As I played clerics when I was younger, we stood by that rule. We only used blunt weapons. However, by the book, something that we may talk about later is multiclassing. And if you dual classed or multi-classed with something like fighter, that really opened up your weapon choices. And then you may want to say, well, wait a minute, is that just strictly by the cleric saying he's not trained in that weapon? He needs to use blunt weapons because of his religious order? Because if he's trained as a fighter, how is the use of a sword going to allow him to go against the belief of his church or his order? So you can get into that debate. Some DMs like to allow the clerics, if they multi-class or dual class, to open up their weapon selection. Others may try to push and make a ruling that clerics, even with the improved hit points, still have to follow the orders of the church or the beliefs of the church. So that can be up to your DM. But strictly by the book, if they did multi-class or dual class, they would have more selection in weapons. So clerical spells, let's take a final look at that to finish up our view of the cleric. We've got spells all the way up to 7th level available. And what are these spells like? In the old player's handbook, it was laid out this way. You could actually see the spells listed by level and how many of them there were. You could use such charts to sort of roll or some sort of random method to see what spells you might take. That'll particularly be useful for magic users, which we'll talk about later. But we've got spells like Bless. Big one here, Cure Light Wounds. So you definitely want to understand that your cleric is your healer. And it surprises me when I think back and I remember playing, and we hardly had any player character clerics. So I remember using potions of healing and all that kind of thing, but I don't remember very often having a cleric in the party, unless I chose to play one. Things like protection from evil. Going up into 2nd level, we have things like slow poison, speak with animals, spiritual hammer. Over here, others like cure blindness, cure disease, and it goes on from there. So a lot of support spells giving you bonuses to maybe armor class and saving throws, cure spells and healing spells. And then there are some other utility spells, and even some spells that attack, such as Blade Barrier, Flame Strike, and others like that. But interesting selection there, and different in ways from the magic user who has no healing spells. Cracking open the Dungeon Master's Guide, I think this may be the first time I've covered anything in this book. We see some extra information on the day-to-day acquisition of cleric spells. Clerics, a little different than magic users, wizard types. They're going to gain their spells through meditation and prayer. Sort of some of the flavor along with the cleric we find in this great book, this 1st edition Dungeon Master's Guide. We see that a beginning cleric, a starting cleric, will have gone through some courses of instruction at the church, at the temple, and they have certain teachings and prayers committed to memory, and they are allowed, therefore, to perform these 1st level spells. But as you advance in level, the source of divine power might alter a little bit. So when we start talking about 3rd, 4th, and 5th level spells, these are obtained through the aid of supernatural servants of the cleric's deity. So it's through meditation and prayer the cleric's needs are understood and the proper spells are given to him by the minions of the deity. And then as you get on even higher than that to 6th and 7th level, they're granted by direct communication from the deity itself. There's no intermediary. So there's kind of a direct hotline to the deity there. So lesser clerics then draw only upon their education, training, and the basic experience that they have, and higher level clerics gain it directly from the deity. So that's interesting. The Dungeon Master's Guide goes on, and it starts talking about a cleric being faithful to the deity, and how the cleric might lose or suffer with certain mistakes in behavior that might run contrary to the deity's desires. So the cleric might need to atone in some way, make up for their transgressions. It could be spending 2 to 8 days in prayer, fasting, sacrifice. It could be other things such as, oh, let's see. It kind of reminds me in some ways of certain real world fates where you need to perform some chants or holy acts or good acts to sort of redeem yourselves in the eyes of God. So that was part of the flavor of playing a cleric back in first edition. So I guess to wrap up the spellcasting side here, unlike a magic user who may find and keep a magic spell book, a cleric needs to pray and is allowed kind of a gift from the gods of that spell. So many DMs will allow a character to, or a player to, look at the list of spells and pray for the spell that they want their character to be able to use for that day. So let's say you're a first level cleric and you want to have a cure light wounds available to use during the adventure. Then you would say to the DM that your character is meditating and praying so that you can have prepared the spell Cure Light Wounds for use that day. So it's not quite so flexible as you can use one spell per day as a first level cleric and then you can just pull out whatever you need. There is still this idea of preparation beforehand where you kind of need to select the spell that you want to have you want to have prayed for. And so you do kind of prepare it almost like loading a weapon, loading a gun. You kind of have that spell prepared and ready to fire off when you need it. However, a DM wanting to provide some more flexibility could do that. I think even in later editions, maybe it was 3rd edition, they started to allow clerics to suddenly switch any spell that they had prepared into a healing spell if the need arose that they needed. Maybe what happened in these earlier editions was everybody was going for Cure Light Wounds and nobody was choosing something like Protection from Evil or Remove Fear or something like that. So I think it was trying to encourage some flexibility and let people choose something else, but then always know that they could switch over to a healing spell on the spot if they needed to. Anyway, just some things to think about and for your DM to make a decision on. But I believe by the book you needed to select the spell, and that was what you had with you. And you just followed those number of spells. What was it? Number of spells usable per day. And there we go. So that will finish up the Cleric. Remember that it was available to most classes, most races. And if we take a look at Cleric here, we have the parentheses that means dwarves are NPCs only, elves are NPCs only, and gnomes are NPCs only. Half-elves can go up to 5th level, halflings cannot be clerics. Half-orcs up to level 4, so most of your clerics are human. Alright, thanks for watching everybody. I'll catch you later for some more advanced Dungeons & Dragons 1st edition.